Welcome to the next in our online conversation series. My name is Paula Gooder and I am Canon Chancellor and Director of Learning here at St Paul's Cathedral. My next conversation is with Erik Varden, Bishop of Trondheim and Cistercian monk, and we're talking about his 2025 Lent book, Healing Wounds. I hope you enjoy this conversation. Erik, it's really lovely to have you with us today, talking about your Lent book. But before we get into the subject of your Lent book, I think there will be various people listening who don't know much about you. So I thought it'd be interesting if we began by having you tell us a little bit about your story. Where did you come from and what caused you to join the Cistercian order? And then we might also want to talk a little bit about who the Cistercians are for people who don't know about the Cistercian order.
Very good. I'll try to put that into a very small nutshell. Well, I was born in Norway in 1974 and grew up in the country. My father was a country vet. I left Norway for what I thought would be a 2-year period at school when I was 16, when I went to Wales to attend Atlantic College, an international sixth form school where I did the IB. But then one thing led to another, and I applied to university from there, and then ended up going up to Cambridge, where I spent 10 years, from 1992 to 2002, where I did a doctorate in church history on a 17th century French topic. And I was research fellow of St. John's College until I resigned that fellowship to join Mount St. Bernard Abbey, a Cistercian abbey in Leicestershire, where I was from 2002 until 2019, when, to my astonishment, I found myself appointed by the Holy Father Bishop of Trondheim in Norway. So I was called back to Norway after 30 years abroad and started my ministry here in 2020.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Are you enjoying being back home in Norway?
I am, and now I've sort of got used to living here again now, and it's interesting. It's interesting to be both a native and a stranger, and I think that's been quite useful also in the sort of work I do, because the Catholic community in Norway is extraordinarily international, pluriethnic, and multilingual. So even here in Trondheim, we have Catholics within the diocese from about 130 nations.
That's amazing, isn't it? It's wonderful. And tell us a little bit about the Cistercian order.
Well, the Cistercians are Benedictines, basically. All monastic life in the West, with very, very few exceptions, has been life following the rule of St. Benedict. The Cistercians are a reform movement, you might say, within that Benedictine school. The word Cistercian relates to a place name, Cîteaux, in Burgundy in France, which comes into Latin as Cistercium, from which the word Cisterciensis was derived. Cîteaux was founded in 1098 by a group of Benedictines from a Benedictine monastery a bit further north called Mollem, simply wanting to live the rule more radically. And Cîteaux was one of any number of reform-minded communities at that time. And the founders didn't set out to start an order. They simply wanted to build a reformed monastery. And for many years, Cîteaux was simply known as Novum Monasterium, the new monastery. But then it flourished, it started making foundations, and a filiation of Cîteaux arose. And it was thanks to the genius, really, of the third abbot of Cîteaux, who happened to be an Englishman called Stephen Harding, who had been a monk of Sherborne, then of Mollem, and was part of the founding group. It was Stephen who had the juridical sense to draw up certain very basic and sensible structures to maintain the coherence of this filiation of foundations. And that's what led to the fact that the monastery became an order. that spread with amazing rapidity throughout Europe, west, east, north, and south, and within 2 or 3 generations was a tremendous force of spiritual renewal throughout Europe.
And what caused you to be drawn into vocation in the Cistercian order? I think a lot of us are fascinated about the kind of the call of the religious life.
Well, I find it fascinating myself, and there's always, there's always a degree of mystery in it, and it's difficult to give an entirely clear discursive answer. I first encountered monastic life, and as it happened, Cistercian life, although at that time I didn't have any notion of what a Cistercian was, when I was 17, when more or less by mistake, I visited a Cistercian monastery and was sort of overwhelmed by it, not necessarily in an unambiguously positive way. I thought it was frightening, the sheer radicalism of this life. And there was something in it that repelled me, and something else that very powerfully attracted me and drew me. There was something about the wholeness of this life, and there was something about the coherence of the choice these monks had made. They'd recognized something as true, and they'd really staked their lives on that. And that I found estimable. And from then on, I was sort of haunted by this experience. It took me a long time. It took me 10 years, a bit more, to actually join the monastery. But it was that first awakening, the encounter with a form of life that was utterly different from anything I'd encountered before. The attraction of it, the scandal of it, but also the beauty of it, that sowed a seed that in time I came to recognize as a vocation. And more clearly, it seemed to me that this sort of life was the life for which I was intended, and that somehow the vocation was inscribed on my being. It's a big thing to say, but it's the only thing I can say to make sense of it. And I'm immensely grateful for that gift, because it's a great life and it's a happy life.
I love that phrase, vocation inscribed on your being. I think a lot of us feel like that when we kind of recognize our vocations, that in a way it's who we are called to be, and not a lot of choice in it when you recognize that.
Absolutely. And the challenge is to consent with total freedom to that elimination of choice, as you say.
So let's turn our attention to your book, which I found absolutely fascinating. We'll start with the title, which I think many people will be intrigued by, Healing Wounds. Talk to us about why you chose to call it that.
Well, I chose to call it that because there is a deliberate ambiguity in the title, because you could construe the wounds as being both the object and the subject of the clause. It's about the healing of wounds, and obviously that's a theme which is central to the whole biblical narrative and to the Christian story. It's always impressed, but it impresses me more and more that in some of the earliest iconographic and poetic accounts of Christ that we find in the catacombs and elsewhere, Christ is referred to as physician. So it's about the healing of wounds, but it's also about that paradoxical experience, which again is a biblical motif, but which I think we can verify through experience, that our wounds, which for a while may condition our lives painfully and grievously, be the wounds physical or spiritual or mental, psychological, can turn into sources of healing for ourselves and others.
And I don't know if you were thinking about it when you did the title. I was also reminded of the iconographic tradition of the wounding, the self-wounding pelican, who kind of
Yes.
whose wounds heal. Was that in your mind as well when you were using the phrase?
It was. I've been intrigued by that image for as long as I can remember. I think it wasn't primary, but it was there in the background because I am deeply conditioned by it.
We should probably explain to people who aren't familiar with it that there is a tradition in Christian artwork that you have a picture of a pelican who is apparently has a wound in their chest that they've caused, and from that wound healing comes. And it comes from a misunderstanding of how pelicans feed their young, I think.
I think so, because there was the account that the pelican mother fed her chicks with her own blood.
Yes, and that became kind of the source of a lot of the inspiration of Jesus on the cross, therefore healing people by his own wounds.
And obviously, and it entered a lot of liturgical poetry, like
yes.
a hymn by St. Thomas Aquinas for Corpus Christi.
And I'm always intrigued by those things where you want to go, well, they weren't quite right, and yet they remain as inspiring as they ever were, even though we now know that isn't quite the correct understanding of a pelican.
Absolutely, and the symbol acquires its own integrity, doesn't it, and takes on a life of its own.
Shall we move on to thinking about the cross? Because a lot of your book focuses around the cross and its importance. And I wondered whether we might start with actually the significance of cross in the Christian tradition, because we are now so used to having crosses in our churches, and they communicate so much to us about the essence of Christianity. But that wasn't really true right at the start of the early Christian movement.
No, and I think, we can easily forget that strong theme in Paul's epistles, talking about the scandal of the cross. Obviously, we see the cross being a scandal in the Gospels as well, but St. Paul thematizes it. We must beware of a conception of the cross which is too aesthetic and prettified. And it was precisely because of the awfulness of what the cross represents materially, and because of the lodging of the Passion Mystery in pain, that the Church was wary of representing Christ crucified pictorially and in liturgical texts in the first few centuries. Because talking about, well, as you know, and as many of the listeners will know, one of the great concerns of the Church in the first few centuries was to make sense of the incarnation. What does it mean to say that Christ is Son of God? What does it mean to say that Christ is God and man? And it was only at the Council of Nicaea, whose 1700th anniversary we celebrate this year in 2025, that the formulaic articulation of that paradox was reached in the form we still recite in the Creed. But then there was the anxiety: how can we describe in narrative the suffering and the passion of Christ, the human need experienced by Christ when he says, I thirst, when he was hungry? How can we talk about those things without compromising his divinity? And so you have other councils working out this paradox in more and more subtle and elaborate and usable and solid language. And it was only really when that was in place that the Church felt free to depict the crucifixion in its historical truth. The first representations we find of the cross in Christian iconography is of the cross in an almost abstract form and bejeweled, expressing that affirmation we find in the fourth gospel of the cross somehow being glorious. So we see the cross hovering over Christ seated on his throne, indicating symbolically and referring by way of code almost to the events of Calvary. But it's much later that we actually find representations of Christ crucified.
And what was it that made people feel more comfortable? I think one of the things that I'm very struck by these days is that if we're looking in terms of church history, we're now very comfortable isn't possibly the right word, but we're used to seeing depictions of the cross. But I think people who are not used to church history still find the cross very troubling and unsettling. And the thing that I'm really fascinated by is the way in which the cross has become normal within Christian culture, but it still remains a very unsettling symbol.
And I think it's important that we should be unsettled by it, and it's good to read it and see it with other eyes. A book that has been extremely helpful to me over the last few years is a book published about 10 years ago by a German novelist and journalist of Iranian descent. He himself is a Shia Muslim. He was given a period of sabbatical writing leave in Rome, and during that time he went around Roman churches looking at Christian art, and he wrote a book of essays about Christian art, which is a sympathetic account, but also an avowedly estranged account, because he's seeing it as an outsider. And I found that very, very illuminating. And I think it's a sort of mental habit that it is good for Christians to cultivate, sometimes to see our own conventional imagery with the eyes of an outsider, in order to see both the strangeness and the marvelousness of it.
And for someone who kind of struggles to get their head around the significance of the cross, in terms of the artistic representation, what would you say to them? I'm thinking particularly from in a more Protestant perspective. So from a Protestant, we would normally have a depiction of the cross without, not a crucifix, with Jesus not on the cross. You would just have the simple cross, whereas in a more Catholic sensibility, you would definitely have Jesus hanging on the cross. And I've heard some people say that they find having Jesus on the cross a troubling image. What would you say in those contexts?
I think the most important thing is to go deep into the New Testament accounts of the Passion, and to let those accounts do their work on us, both intellectually and effectively, and always to remember to read the cross in context, because, well, it is the crucifixion is in some ways the dramatic climax of the gospel narrative, but it is at the same time a transitional account, because the cross is not an end in itself. The cross is precisely, and Jesus's death on the cross is an entry into an intensity of life and the enactment of the victory of life over death, which enables that great Pauline exclamation, "O death, where is your sting? Where is your victory?" You know, death alone is dead. So always to read the cross in the light of the resurrection, which is the foundational and identity shaping Christian tenet of faith, but at the same time not to relativize the cross, and to dare to confront in its literal and naked truth the extent of God's self-outpouring in Christ, and thereby to begin to get a sense of the intensity of love that occasions such an act.
You mentioned a moment ago John's vision of the cross being kind of full of glory. And I always think with the gospel accounts, you have Mark at one end, where you have kind of the grim reality of the cross laid bare and very little resurrection. And you have the other end where you have the cross's glory in John. In terms of your own devotion, where would you place yourself? Which is your favorite gospel account of the crucifixion? And how does that kind of resonate for you?
I think my only possible answer to that would be all four.
Correct answer.
And I think it's really important to read them in symphony, and to hear the different accents together. And I think all of us go through, a trajectory of evolving perception, and it's not necessarily a linear trajectory. And so we need all the perspectives in order to begin to get some sense of the height and depth and the length and the breadth of the mystery and the historical truth contained in the symbol.
You talk a lot in your book about the importance of bodies, obviously, particularly Jesus's body on the cross, but also our own bodies. Why do you think bodies are so important in our Christian spirituality?
Well, we do live in them. And obviously, and we are immensely conditioned by our bodies, and we are, particularly in our particular cultural context, we're a bit obsessed with our bodies. And one of the things that is so enriching and fascinating about the Christian faith is that it proposes a sublimely spiritual account of the human being that at the same time takes our physical reality so seriously. I think I might perhaps just say, in the context of this book, 2 words about the way in which I've structured it, because I've taken as my point of departure a Cistercian text, which was long attributed to St. Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the great Cistercian writers of the second generation, but which we now know is of a slightly later origin, but certainly Cistercian. And it is a meditation in 7 parts on Christ crucified. And it's at the same time a realistic and poetic, a serene and deeply affected account of a believer placing himself resolutely at the foot of the cross and contemplating the Saviour's crucified body. And he moves up from the feet to the knees, to the hands, to the side, to the breast, to the heart, to the face, and brings out the human and the theological, what one might say, the divine consequence of this extraordinary self-outpouring of one who has given his life for his friends. And so we are faced through this poem with the sheer physicality of the Passion narrative. And at the same time, the author, a certain Abbot Arnulf, brings out the sublime spiritual implication of what we see.
Can you talk a little bit more about that contemplation idea? Because I think, in a sense, your book is a meditation around the importance of contemplation. And I'm really struck by, you have in the book concepts, but you've also got visual. How for yourself, as somebody who contemplates, how do you go about contemplating, and how do you bring together ideas and visual ideas?
Well, I think that there's a risk that we make of the notion of contemplation something a bit too complicated and a bit too woolly. In literal etymological terms, contemplation is fundamentally to do with seeing. It's about observing things as they are. So the prerequisite for anyone aspiring to become a contemplative is to decide to live with open eyes and to see things as they really are, to confront the world as it is, myself as it is, God as he is, not in terms of my own projection, but in terms of putting myself squarely before the otherness of the other. and to have the patience to see what is before me in all its aspects. So the contemplative exercise, obviously it's a word that with time has acquired many layers of meaning in the Christian vocabulary, and we could talk about this for hours. But I would say fundamentally, the contemplative exercise is about being still, which is difficult for us now, who are obsessively running around and forever, consulting little screens and more or less perceiving reality primarily through the screen, and then one now and again looking off the screen just to see if what's actually around me corresponds to what I can see on my iPhone. So to become a contemplative, the first thing to do is to put one's iPhone in one's pocket in flight mode, ideally, and then to stand still and to see what is before me. And then to try and take in what I see in every aspect, and then to ask myself, what is this saying to me? What is the word which is I see, and what sort of response does that word elicit from me, and what does it ask of me? That would be a beginning.
And that, in a way, that kind of brings me on to my question. There'll be lots of people listening who are about to embark on Lent. And in a sense, I think what's really fascinating about your reflections in this book is it's an invitation into contemplation during Lent. So if somebody is at the start of Lent and wondering how they might begin to live a faithful Lent this year, maybe in a slightly different way, you talked a little bit about contemplation and why it's important. What advice would you give to people?
Well, first of all, I would say follow the liturgy, because we find in the Church's liturgy an extraordinarily well thought out and well structured pedagogy for Christian living and for deepening the Christian mystery. And then I would say, look at your life and see how the noise level might possibly be reduced. Look at your life and ask yourself, what am I longing for? What is my heart's deep desire? And what stands in the way of my heart's deep desire? And then see if you can perhaps clear away some of those obstacles. Look at your life and ask yourself, am I free? All of us want to be free. At least we all say we want to be free, but we can be terribly attached at the same time to the things that shackle us. So take a good look at your life and ask, where is unfreedom in my life? And then see what you can do about that. See which chains might be snapped, which unhealthy dependencies can be broken, perhaps which addictions need address, perhaps help, and believe in the possibility of freedom, not just in an abstract, generic sense, but in freedom for yourself. Cling to that. Another great Pauline statement, when the apostle says, "For freedom Christ has set us free." Believe in the literal truth of that, and don't resign yourself to servitude. Leave Egypt. That's one of the great scriptural themes of Lent. We follow the Exodus narrative, whereby Israel leaves captivity and moves towards the promised land. Ask yourself, where is the promised land for me now? And what is the desert I've got to traverse in order to reach it? And then fill your water bottle.
Yes, good idea. I'd like to kind of loop back a little bit to the reflecting on wounds that we began with. So the title of the book, Healing Wounds, thinking both about our own wounds that can be healed and Jesus's wounds that heal us. What place do wounds have in our Lenten journey, and how would you advise people to reflect on those wounds?
Well, I think I would invite them to reflect on them by identifying them. All of us carry wounds of one kind or another. Wounds that are part of our history, some that may go right back into our childhood, wounds that result from being given too much of something, too little of another thing, wounds of fractured relationships, wounds of illness, of bereavement, of trauma perhaps. And we spend a lot of time thinking about those wounds for ourselves. You know, anyone who lives with an attentive ear to what humanity is like will know that a lot of our inner dialogue is to do with talking to ourselves about our wounds. At the same time, we try desperately sometimes to project an image of self that is absolutely the image of perfection, and in which nothing is lacking and in which nothing is wrong. I'm not saying that the ideal is to project our wounds outwardly, but the ideal is honesty. And the ideal is to recognize what affects and perhaps limits my existence in terms of my woundedness. And then, this is crucial, to ask, where can healing be found? Because I think, to come back to what we talked about earlier about, the cross in our churches, we can get so used to this motif that we, in terms of our devotional poetry, the hymns we sing, perhaps even the prayers we articulate for ourselves, that we idealize wounds. And we mustn't do that, because wounds in Christian discourse, in a Christian way of seeing reality, are always an anomaly, even as death is an anomaly. Death is a scandal. And the significance of wounds is precisely the fact that Christ has come to heal them. The significance of death for a Christian is that Christ has come to conquer it. And so, to take whatever measures we can in order to expose our wounds constructively, courageously, and also humbly to the healing grace of Christ, and to let him work freely and to exercise his profession of divine physician in our lives, concretely, really, thereby to become, by the grace of God, witnesses to his healing power.
And that, I think, brings me nicely on to my final question, which is about Easter. We've been talking a lot about the cross and the importance of the cross and our Lenten journey. But of course, the whole goal of the Lenten journey through the cross is to get up on Easter morning and to celebrate the resurrection. Can you talk a little bit about why Jesus' resurrection is so important in your faith?
Well, because it is the event and the truth that constitutes reality. And because I, as any Christian, try to construct my life on that certainty that death does not have the final word, and that anything which smacks of death, sin, betrayal, weakness, collapses of integrity, all those things are non-final. And that God has entered our humanity, not just as a passing guest, but in order to remain within it as a living presence, and in order to renew our humanity from within, so that it is Easter that defines my Christian existence. But I also believe that it is Easter that defines and gives the hermeneutic key to the riddle of reality as such, to the structure of the cosmos. And that is why it is essential to remain with our eyes fixed precisely on Easter morning, and to remember that Lent, that contemplation of the journey up towards Jerusalem and the accomplishment of the saving events on Calvary, are precisely a passage an exodus, a journey, but that the goal towards which all this points is eternal life in adoration and thanksgiving, in that immense community and communion of love, which we think of as everlasting life, life with God, life in God, in Christ.
Thank you. That feels like a wonderful place to end. It's been really great talking to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.